Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you online, I'd like to welcome you to our lunchtime seminar. Today, we feature Hazel Barton and James Eagan. So Hazel's been at the university for
10 years.
10 years now. She is in the Department of Biology. She is a microbiologist by training, and she spends her time underground. Last time she was here, she spoke to us about fighting off polar bears in Greenland on her way to caving. But today, she's going to talk about the relationship between deep under the earth and high above the ground. So, Hazel.
Thanks, Dane. Thanks, everyone who's here. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the work that we've been doing in Wind Cave in South Dakota. This is just a picture of a passage that we found in China, Attic, just to give you an idea of the kind of caves and the kind of caving that we're doing. A lot of people imagine caves very much the same way that they would on a tourist trail, which is very, very different from the kind of caving that we do. So Wind Cave in South Dakota, it's in the Black Hills, so it's not far from Mount Rushmore. It's about an hour drive from Mount Rushmore. It's one of the biggest and oldest caves in the world. It's 157 miles long right now, and most of the length of that cave is actually a three-dimensional maze within a 1 mile square. And I actually started going to this cave when it was about 53 miles long as a graduate student. So first year graduate school, I actually started going up there to map it and help increase the length. And I got really interested in the cave and exploring it. And it has a lot of weird features. It has the biggest display in the world of these things called subaqueous helictites. So these are these kind of very odd, unusual shapes that emerge out of the floor, and they're found throughout the cave. And they can be very small. You can see that one's got a pound per scale, or pretty big. The one in the middle is about 50 centimeters high. And we don't really understand how they form. They can be about 3 feet high. The geologists aren't sure. When I went to the cave as a first-year graduate student and saw them for the first time, I said that looks like a microbial biofilm, and then it was poo-pooed by the geologists because the central core is made of manganese, and nobody really understands how you can have this weird tree-like shape made of manganese, hundreds of feet underground. And the caves are also known for the lakes, so I was never allowed to visit the lakes when I was visiting the cave. They're a pretty protected site. And the lakes at Wind Cave are unusual because you're not actually, it's not like a regular lake, like a basin that you would imagine. So most lakes are kind of like, basin of rock that you get rainwater filling up like a bathtub. So lakes at Wind Cave are actually where the cave intersects the surface of the Madison Aquifer. So the Madison Aquifer is one of the biggest, most important aquifers in the United States. It brings water to 5 different states, all groundwater, so it's all deep underground. And if you drill a well, you're going to drill down to this confined layer of limestone that the lakes are found in. It's called the Madison limestone. About 85% of agriculture in these states is actually supported by the water that's pulled up from the Madison Aquifer. And we were asked to go look at it because there's a plan to put a well in just outside the park that's going to pull enough water for 60,000 homes, right? So there's no homes right now, and they're going to put a well in to produce water for 60,000 homes, and that's basically going to drain the aquifer. So the potentiometric surface, that is the top of the aquifer, would actually drop about 30 feet from that drill down. And as a result, you wouldn't be able to access it through the cave. So we were asked to go in there and look at it and determine some of the microbiology of this aquifer. And the cave gives us a really unusual way of doing it because we literally can climb down and look at the lake. So the lake itself is huge. About 2 miles of cave are flooded with this lake. You're about 147 meters, so close to 400 feet underground. The youngest water in this lake takes 27 years to get there from the surface. The oldest takes a really tortuous route and actually fell as rain about 50,000 years ago. So you get this very unusual mixing zone of different waters coming through the aquifer, but it's really, really low in organic carbon. Tap water in your sink is probably going to have about 100 times as much organic carbon, even when it's clean, as you get in these lakes. So they're very, very clean, very pristine. We tried to sample the lakes and had a really hard time doing that. Most microbes can't be studied by growing them. What you have to do is you have to isolate the DNA and study their DNA. And we had a really hard time pulling DNA out. We couldn't figure out why, so we actually did a count. It turns out that wind caves, this is just a table of the average cell numbers of different bodies of water on Earth, starting with regular open ocean, which is 10 million cells per mil, down to wind cave, and it was at 22,300 cells per mil. This is one of the lowest measured bacterial load of any water on Earth. The only place it's been found that's lower is accretion ice from Lake Vostok, which is a lake that's been buried under the ice for 4 million years in Antarctica, and about 3,600 meters deep, so over 2 miles deep in the pore water of a gold mine in South Africa. So a really unique site. The other thing that's weird about this site, when we studied it, the bacteria are incredibly small. So this is a table of lots of different bacteria that are pretty common on Earth, and it shows the estimated cell diameter. And if you think about E. coli, you're going to be about 0.5 micrometers for E. coli, which is a pretty small bacteria. And our bugs were down here in this DPAN and Patsy bacteria, Teskey bacteria were down here. So we were actually below the theoretical limit of life. So the love of our cells are around about 0.1 micron in diameter, which is really, really small. And most of the sampling methods we use can't trap them because they're too small, they go too slow. So we had to use a special filter. This is a tangential flow filter that's actually used in kidney dialysis. And it has a 40 nanometer pore, so 100 times smaller again than what we needed, or 10 times smaller than what we needed. We had to filter 1,400 liters of water to get enough DNA for our studies. And then we got that, and we looked at the entire genome, so all the genetic material of all the microorganisms down there, to figure out how they were making a living. And it turned out that the biggest source of energy for growth of the microbes in the system was manganese, which is really weird. We don't really know of any systems that are powered by manganese. But then I thought, oh, well, there's those manganese helictype bushes. I wonder if there's a relationship. Just about the same time we figured this out, a paper came out in Nature where they demonstrated the ability of microorganisms to use manganese as a source of energy. So these manganese can pull electrons, these bacteria can pull electrons out of manganese and power their energetics to grow. So this is Jared Ledbetter's group in Caltech figured this out. It turned out we had exactly the same genes in our population. We then went ahead and assembled the kind of the genetic barcode we used to identify microorganisms, and we used that to see what our bug looked like compared to that bug. So our bug is this one in black up here, and this bug that can do the manganese oxidation for energetics is down here. So it turned out that we basically have that same bug that's using manganese as a source of energy in our lakes. And it's dominant. It's about 18% of the population, which is really, really big. So we had initially thought that maybe manganese was just kind of in the lakes and the sediments, and it was feeding microbial community. But if you think about the ocean, where you have these hydrothermal vents that make these chimneys, they looked a little bit like what we were seeing with these helictype bushes. So what we actually think is that there's a crack, a fault in the rock that allows, in places, water from below. There's a layer of rock below that's high in manganese. The water kind of gets pushed up because it's part of the aquifer, and at the site where you get that water being pushed up, you get these helictype bushes forming, and that's how you get these unusual structures. We know that they were forming underwater because they're coated in these calcite rafts. These calcite calcite rafts form on the surface of the lake, and then as the lake retreats, they kind of get tangled up. So these helictite bushes are higher in the cave, so we've seen basically ancient lakes in the cave, and these calcite rafts are as old as 1 million years. And then this is just a map of Wind Cave showing where all these helictite bushes are, and this is where the lakes are. So we've got a real clear picture that the cave used to be flooded right up to here, and then as the water drained, we ended up with the lakes down here. But we still have these helictite bushes of evidence of that microbial activity. So how is this? Oh, and to get down there, it takes a lot of work, right? We're really at the limit of what we can do because we have to take batteries with us, and getting down to these lakes is really challenging. It's about, sorry about that. It's about, it takes about 3 hours to get there, and you have to go through things like this to get there. It's very challenging. Is that their ability to actually carry out this kind of work? So we reached out to an aerospace engineer who builds robots for Europa, and we're said that, you know, we've got this cave system, we'd like to study the microbiology, but we're in the limits of our tech. And it turns out that Bill is also a famous caver, so he's used to the kinds of conditions that we're working under. So together we designed a device which we call Beagle, which is Benthic Explorer and Genome and Limnology Explorer. I can't remember. We came up with NASA likes acronyms. So we applied to NASA to get funding, and the idea is that this thing can be broken down into small enough parts to fit down to the lakes, reassembled, and then it's an autonomous vehicle that will go hunting for the microbes and the manganese and try to find these helictite bushes forming in real time so we can determine if there's something happening. And the nice thing is it's got a big antenna signal up through the rock, and it will text me if it finds something, and I can jump in a plane and go there, and it will collect our samples, and then it will swim back to us and deliver samples for us. And its relevance to NASA is that you get these big manganese oxide deposits all through the caves, and they haven't really been able to explain how these formed. They know that they're related to the manganese rich water that might be coming in, but we don't quite know where it's coming from. Our study suggests that it's fueling microbial communities. These are big ancient caves. So there's plenty of times for the microbes to use this manganese as a source of energy, and they're basically pooping out these manganese oxides. And last year, they discovered manganese oxides in Gale Crater on Mars. So this is Curiosity. And they found this is a huge deposit of manganese oxides, and they don't know how they formed. On Earth, they thought that manganese oxides need a lot of oxygen to form. Of course, there's never been any oxygen on Mars because there's no photosynthesis. And our study suggests that in groundwater, these things are quite common because of the role of microorganisms. So thanks to the folks in our lab, this work was done by Olivia Hershey. She actually got most of the grants needed to support this work from the Cave Conservation Foundation. And then thanks to all the staff at Wind Cave National Park, who've been going there since 2007 to collect, and a lot of them have to help pump all the gear through the cave. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Hey, thanks, Hazel. If there are any questions from virtual guests or guests here in person, please type them in the chat, and I will relay them to Hazel. Let's see.
Oh, right now?
Yeah. Well, we'll see if there are any questions. So the manganese, is that just leached out as the water makes its way to the...
So the Black Hills are uplifted, they're tilted,
right,
and you get rainwater up here, and because the rock is bent like this, you get artesian flow. So it's like hydrostatic pressure.
right.
So as it falls here, it kind of drops down the slope, and if you have a crack anywhere, it's just going to come up under pressure, so it's an artesian flow.
Right.
And depending on what that water goes through before it comes up, that's the chemistry that comes with the water. And underneath it is the Deadwood Formation, which is a fire silicate that's got a ton of manganese in it, as much as 0.1%. So there's plenty of manganese sourced from there. And I didn't really get into the geochemistry of it, but manganese oxides are really important at absorbing contaminants and trace organics. Right. So they actually play a really important role in keeping water clean. So part of the reason that this water is drinkable in the Black Hills could be related to this kind of microbial activity, not because they're breaking down the organics per se, but they're making these oxides that absorb all of the chemicals and other contaminants that get into groundwater.
So I guess this manganese oxide producing bacteria is not common, or is it? Do you know?
I think this might be the first manganese oxide. This might be the first community that's primarily driven by manganese oxides. And I'm not aware of it being described. It's really well known in the deep ocean, right. And it's a really important way of turning over organic carbon in the deep ocean. So you get these deep ocean sediments that are really rich in manganese oxide, but you don't see it elsewhere in the water column because the manganese oxides are actually susceptible to sunlight and get broken down by sunlight. So it could be that you have to be underground in the dark for this whole process to work in the first place.
And so my last question, is there any correlation between that biochemical process and the size of the bugs?
Yeah, so that's the weird thing. Yeah.
I mean, that was striking that they're so small.
And they are, this particular clade is not known to be small, so our bugs seem to be very, very small. And that's probably related to the extremely nutrient-limited environment, because if you are under really low nutrient conditions, you have to have a really large volume to size ratio. Same thing with our lungs, right? I don't know what our lungs is, like 17 meters, because that's how much you need oxygen to absorb for an organism of our size, right. And it's all convoluted, right? Another way you can do it is you can get very small. When you get very small, your membrane gets comparatively large, yep. In comparison. And because these things are gonna, a lot of the nutrients they need are diffusible, if you have that volume to size ratio, that's your energetic constraint, and you can overcome it by being small enough. So we think I think it's up to 40% of the cells that we find down there are ultra small. So one of the lowest cell numbers on Earth, one of the biggest populations of ultra small cells on Earth, and one of the few manganese oxidizing communities that's been described. But that aquifer is, thousands of square miles, and the only way to access it without a well is through the cave. And when you access it with a well, you end up sampling all the material in the well casing and all the minerals and chemistry and microbiology between the Madison aquifer and the surface. So we've tested wells and we don't get the same microbiology. So this gives us a really easy way of actually looking at the Madison aquifer. So the reason it might be a clean source of drinking water so many people can use is because of this kind of microbiology.
Cool. All right. Hey, thanks.
Yeah. For the slide that you show a little machine that go into the water and like a sample, like how do they work? Do they detect manganese oxide from the microorganism that you're interested, or do they just like collect sample at random and then you with the results later?
Yeah. So the question is, with the robot,
yes,
what would it detect manganese oxides?
Yeah.
So we're looking for two things. We haven't built it yet because we need the funding. That's the picture we put in the proposal. So one is you looking for manganese gradients, because the idea if manganese is everywhere and it's just diffusing in, we wouldn't see any gradients in the lake. But if there's like a point source where it's coming in, we should be able to navigate towards it. And this thing can track its position. It's got LiDAR. I can't remember, it's some kind of bottom sensing thingy that engineers know. I'm sorry, I apologize to all engineers. So it can map where it's at in 3 dimensions and figure out where things are. So it's looking for a manganese 2 dissolved manganese gradient. And it's also going to have microfluidics for cell counting. So it's actually going to count the cells. And the idea is if you approach one of these manganese hotspots, you should also see the cell number go up. And the nice thing with microfluidics is it can differentiate between particulates that might be clays or sediment in the water from actual living cells because of impedance. So it should be a way of doing that. And if not, if we don't see any of those things, then it suggests that there's more of a diffuse source of manganese coming in, and maybe we need to think about those helictites. But I think the helictites are like a fossilized remnant of basically a new kind of vent that we've never described before.
Do you think if you probably can't go in the lake?
That's the problem, right? Everything we're doing is arm's length into the lake, which is why we have to build something that we could sterilize and push out.
So do you think there are those manganese trees, at the bottom of the lake?
I think so. In theory, they should be still there. Yeah. Otherwise, we wouldn't see those bugs in the lake. Yeah. And they wouldn't be, 20% is, you rarely get that in natural systems. That level of enrichment. Yeah. Cool.
All right. Anything else? Okay. Thanks, Hazel. So, and then Hazel, I guess if you can, looks like if you can stop sharing your screen.
Yeah.
And then James will start sharing his screen. Okay, so our final talk today comes to us by way of James Eagan, who is a professor in the Polymer Science and Polymer Engineering School, and also one of our co-equipment instructors. So we roped him in twice. James, go ahead.
Yeah, and I saw some of my students in the chat too, so thanks for joining. So I'm going to talk about plastics today, and specifically, we're going to talk about the sustainability of plastics, and it might be in a way that you don't immediately think of. So I'm not going to talk about recycling. I'm going to talk about where our plastics come from and how we can make them from sustainable sources to try to solve some of the challenges associated with sustainability in our emissions. So I am a synthetic chemist. That means I like to make molecules. I describe it as being a molecular construction worker. But rather than building skyscrapers out of steel, concrete, cranes, and hammers, we make polymers, and we make them from molecules using the tools of catalysis. And polymers really are the skyscrapers of the molecular world. They're not small molecules. We make them by linking multiple molecules together over and over and over again until we get to something very big. This is not a polymer. This would be considered a polymer, and this would be a very small polymer. And these long chains of polymers are made up of carbon. And I'm very interested in carbon. I think carbon is one of the most fascinating elements. This makes me an organic chemist. And we really like to study the reactivity of carbon and how we can manipulate and build useful molecules about it. It's the building block not only of our plastics and our polymers, but we make our pharmaceuticals out of it. And it's also integrated into our energy system. And so everybody is talking about carbon. Over the last 2 weeks, the United Nations just met to talk about carbon. There is too much carbon in the atmosphere. There are entire nations that are threatened by climate change and global sea level rises. And this is because we've been emitting more and more and more carbon at exponential rates. So when I was born, we were at 350 ppm. And if that had stayed on a straight line, you can see where we would be. And this is just to demonstrate that we are dumping increasingly more and more carbon into the atmosphere. When most of you that are undergraduates here, it was at 375, and we're at 420 parts per million today. So where did all this carbon come from? Carbon is so important, it gets its own geological epoch. The Carboniferous period is from about 300 million years ago. And in this artist's depiction of some of the fossil records that we have, you see these giant, massive trees, but these actually aren't trees. Their closest living relative, according to the biologists and the paleontologists, are that of moss. And they are using carbon dioxide and photosynthesis as their energy source. There might be some manganese organisms in here somewhere, but most of them are just sucking out the carbon dioxide. They're growing enormous. 300 million years ago, our Earth was a single continent covered in a very shallow ocean. So when these trees do eventually fall over, they fall into the seabed, they sink, and they gradually, over 300 million years, got turned into our coal and our fossil fuels. And in a relative geological blink of an eye, in 300 years, we have essentially incinerated nearly all of that carbon, putting it back into the atmosphere. And so for those of you that are in my honors colloquium, you know, throughout every section we talk about what is the carbon. And so when this tree falls over and is buried under the sea, there's no oxygen on it. And over 300 million years, and it's deprived of oxygen, becomes highly reduced. And that highly reduced state of carbon is a lot of energy. And at one point, we've learned that incineration and combustion is an oxidation reaction, and that byproduct is both carbon dioxide and energy. And so our industrial activity over the last 3 centuries really has been just sucking energy out of highly reduced carbon, and the byproduct is highly oxidized carbon, which is a waste product. There's no energy left to use it. And that's the challenge. So we have all this waste, all this carbon in the atmosphere. And here's what we try to do in our lab, is basically reverse the process. As a synthetic chemist that looks and thinks about carbon, what if instead of using this as a waste, we thought of it as a feedstock? Can we make fine chemicals and value-added products like plastics and polymers out of carbon dioxide? Because if we do that, it changes all of the economics of emissions and waste, and it's a very inexpensive and renewable feedstock to start making useful products from. So that's how we're approaching this problem. And what we're looking at here is how much plastic we produce. In 2014, we made 300 million tons. We make about 350 million tons of plastics today. By 2050, we're going to make over 1 billion tons of plastic. That means if we get this right, we can take over 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it into value-added plastics over every single year. So this is just showing that exponential growth. And you might be scratching your head and thinking, does this guy really want to make more plastic? And that's up for debate, because we have another issue, which is there's too much plastic in the environment, right? By this same metric, 1 billion tons could be made from CO2. Well, that billion tons, if it ends up in the ocean, is going to outweigh the amount of fish by 2050. So we're about to have more plastic than fish in our seas. So you can absolutely and should be critical of producing more plastic, regardless of where it comes from. Because plastic lasts and persists in the environment for centuries, sometimes millennia. And so virtually every piece of polyolefin plastic that's ever been made is still in the environment. And we have to do a lot of work to now try to clean it up. So I recently showed my students some of the work coming from the ocean cleanup, and I got my cool ocean cleanup glasses to support their work. This is made out of 100% ocean plastic reclaimed from the ocean, and I highly recommend checking out that work. We absolutely have to be responsible about how we manage our waste. We also can look at what happens when we incorporate this carbon dioxide. So in our group, what we've done is we've been using these carbon feedstocks, and especially CO2, to make these polymer chains. And what we discovered recently is that when you do this, and you get this carbon dioxide shown now in these orange linkages in the chain, something interesting happens. That partial oxidation of the polymer chain actually makes this chain more degradable. So on the left, I'm showing traditional plastics, and in the middle is the materials that we synthesize as they are sitting in aqueous medium at 1 week. So there's still some particles around in that material. But give it enough time and it'll completely biodegrade in order to produce these small molecules that then are more chemiabsorbable in the environment. And so by making the material out of CO2, we also impart a sustainable grade in the form of degradability. And we recently reported this in ACS macro letters. I'm showing the reference here. And there are certainly some important questions left here. Are these byproducts safe? Right? Just because it degrades in the environment doesn't mean it's good for the environment. So we need to evaluate the safety of those products. We have no idea how we're going to make 1 billion tons of this material right now. We have a lot of chemistry to do that. And then we also need to understand what the material is good for. So I brought a little sample of what this CO2 plastic looks like. And so this is a film of a polycarbonate made from CO2. It's about 30% weight carbon dioxide. And it's kind of soft, it flexes, it stretches, but this isn't the most useful plastic material that we could imagine. And so just by making this material alone, we're not going to save the world. We really need to make it good and in fact better than our existing plastics. So what is it good for? And this is where the researchers at the University of Akron can really make a lot of contributions. So we've looked at carbon fiber reinforced plastics. These are very important composite materials. Those of you that might be in mechanical engineering or aerospace engineering use carbon fiber for fuselages, for airplanes, and for motor vehicles. It makes them lightweight. And if they're lightweight, we burn less fuel, we have less emissions. It also is a critical material for sustainable technologies. We cannot build a wind turbine without a carbon fiber reinforced plastic for the turbines themselves. You need something lightweight and extremely strong. And that's what plastics are specifically good for. The problem, though, with this technology is that fibers are extremely energy intensive to make. We emit both a lot of CO2 to make the carbon fiber, and it costs a lot of money. And once it's embedded in an epoxy resin, it's stuck for a century or more. So typically when wind turbines are decommissioned, we put them into the desert, we bury them, and that's it. We got 30 years of renewable energy, only to then have an immense amount of solid waste. So how can we recycle them? And so with the expertise in our School of Polymer Science, I am far on the chemistry side, and so we also need experts in polymer engineering. And this is where the combination of science and engineering really comes together. And so there's a team sponsored by the Department of Energy, and we're collaborating with aerospace engineers at Raytheon Technologies on how to better develop this material into a carbon fiber reinforced plastic. This is going to allow us to do a couple of things. Not only is the material made from CO2, but the carbon fibers can be recovered. And so we have this degradability of the material that allows us to remove this cross-linked thermoset, and we can recover the carbon fiber. So we can recycle the materials. And so this is really key in order to address some of these shortcomings. And for those of you that are undergraduates and interested in learning more, check out our graduate programs. You can shoot me an email. I'll be happy to help point you in the right direction. And like I said, this is a collaboration between engineers, whether they're chemical, mechanical, aerospace, as well as our scientists from chemistry. With that, I'm going to acknowledge my group and specifically highlight some of the undergraduates that have worked in this area. So Walter, Thomas, Ryan, and Manuel are all part of the Williams Honors College and have done research in the lab. And so William also has done a lot of great work in some of our sustainability efforts. This work is sponsored by the Department of Energy and the ACS. Thank you all for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Again, are there any questions from those in person or online? Let me know, and I will relay them.
I have a question. What's going on with the polymer chemistry that it's breaking down if you're using atmospheric CO2?
So when we show this cartoon, not a lot of information in there. The CO2 linkages and the real technical aspect behind this is that if you take a monomer for a polymer, typically an olefin, like butadiene in this case, or ethylene or propylene, if you make a polymer out of that, you get an all-carbon backbone, completely non-degradable, will last for centuries. In theory, if a carbon dioxide molecule came in, you would get a moiety known as an ester, and you would have a polyester. And polyesters hydrolyze very readily in the environment. They are the compostable plastics that we like. So it's a simple idea, let's get CO2 into there. But from the chemistry perspective, that is enthalpically and entropically very disfavored. And so what our work developed was a dual catalyst system. So we have a palladium catalyst that incorporates the carbon dioxide with the butadiene. And then we have a second catalyst that actually performs a polyester polymerization. And so it's a way of kind of bypassing that thermodynamic and entropic barrier.
What's the energy requirement for making these CO2 based plastics?
The largest barrier will be getting the CO2. These don't operate at 0.04% of CO2, which is what is the natural abundance in the atmosphere. So we don't take our catalysts and leave it open in the air and CO2 gets sucked out. We need to hook it up to a high pressure reactor, and we actually probably vent more CO2 than actually went into reaction. And so where does that CO2 come from is really, really important. You can get it, right now, commercially, you'll get it from a brewery, or you will get it from a dry ice supplier. The vision is that for plants, for example, those that are being built in Iceland and Greenland, where they're actually sucking carbon dioxide out using geothermal energy, right now they don't have anything to do with that CO2. So they bury it, which is sequestration and is great, but it's not a financial business model. And so if we can provide some technology that then utilizes that CO2 to produce a compostable plastic, now it helps to feed into the entire economics of the system as well.
Does it need to be gaseous CO2 or do you use like bicarbonate?
We don't know.
Because we got bugs that fix CO2 with bicarbonate.
Carbonate here.
Any magnesium?
Magnesium carbonate. Maybe. Magnesium carbonate.
Yeah, that's actually what fuels the bugs. They can only use magnesium carbonate. But yeah, I review for that program, so I get to see a lot of these. But yeah, as long the stuff that works with the sequestration and deep underground, that's you need supercritical CO2. So the amount of energy, and you've got to scrub it, it's got to be more than 99.9% clean. So anything that doesn't get you to that point, I think is going to be a good system.
And there's a lot of work in catalysis right now. How do we get these to operate at lower and lower and lower pressures? There's some great systems out of a lab at Oxford where you can get a balloon of CO2, and that is probably the state of the art, 1 atmosphere of CO2.
Great.
Yep.
So right now, when you're doing experiment using CO2, so you mentioned that you use catalyst as a palladium metal. Like, so for experimental scale, it would be very small, where you require only small amount of catalyst. But like, how viable is it right now to use this palladium metal in maybe like bigger scale to be like producing these polymer in like viable, practical way?
Absolutely. So the question is, the number 2 will be limited because it's a palladium catalyst. Palladium's a rare earth metal. It's extremely expensive. And so step 1 will absolutely have to be, how do we achieve a more earth-abundant catalyst? Or how do we recover the catalyst? And so we have done work to create a continuous process where you don't have to constantly add new catalysts. You can use the same catalyst over and over again, because if it's a catalyst, it should be unchanged. And there are limitations to that. But there are commercial processes where we use heterogeneous catalysts. So, for example, white sugar is a hydrogenated sugar material. We've refined it over a carbon black supported palladium catalyst with hydrogen. We use this with hydrogenated oils. And so there's a lot of examples of using palladium commercially. Alternatively, we would go to nickel, or even more preferably iron, for something that's more abundant. Yeah. A lot of chemistry needs to go to that. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Dave.
Well, thanks again. Thanks for everybody who joined in today. This is the last one we're going to do this semester, but we'll have more next semester. Take care.
Are we done? Did I get you again? I should have done my CO.